For thousands of years, America already had coffee. Not coffee beans from Colombia, not espresso from Italy, not tea imported from China. A wild plant grew naturally across the forests of the American South, with enough caffeine to power entire civilizations. Native Americans brewed it long before Europeans arrived. Colonists exported it overseas. And at one point, some people genuinely believed it could become America's national drink. It required no plantations, no tropical farms, no global shipping routes. It simply grew everywhere. Then somehow, America forgot it existed. Today, almost nobody knows that the United States once had the only caffeinated plant native to North America. And the story of how it disappeared reveals something much bigger than a forgotten drink. It reveals how entire industries can erase nature itself. Because before America became addicted to imported coffee, it already had its own. And its name was Yaupon Holly. If you walked past a Yaupon Holly today, you probably wouldn't even notice it. It doesn't look special. No giant fruits, no exotic flowers, no towering canopy. Just a dense green shrub growing quietly across Texas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and the Carolinas. Millions of Americans have probably seen it without realizing what it was. Landowners often treated it like a weed. Some bulldozed entire fields of it. Others burned it down. But hidden inside its leaves was caffeine. Naturally occurring caffeine, the same stimulant that built global coffee empires, the same molecule humans crossed oceans to obtain, the same chemical that powers offices, factories, universities, and billion-dollar corporations every single morning. And for thousands of years, that caffeine was already growing wild in North America, long before Starbucks, long before espresso machines, long before coffee chains turned caffeine into a lifestyle. Indigenous societies in the American Southeast had already mastered this plant. They harvested the leaves, roasted them, dried them, brewed them into tea, and consumed it in ceremonies so important that early European explorers became obsessed with describing them. To the people who used it, this wasn't just a drink. It was culture, medicine, trade, ritual, identity. Some tribes called it the beloved drink. Others referred to it as the black drink. And according to historical accounts, it was consumed across massive parts of the southeastern United States for centuries. That alone is remarkable. But what makes the story truly unbelievable is that America almost built an entire caffeine industry around it. Today, it feels impossible to imagine America without coffee. Coffee is practically woven into the country's identity. The morning commute, the office cup, the gas station refill, the cafe culture, the endless productivity obsession. Coffee became so normalized that most people assume it was always here, but it wasn't. Coffee came from overseas, and for a long time it was expensive. Fragile supply chains transported beans across oceans from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Before global coffee dominance, colonial America had a different opportunity, a domestic caffeine source, one that already grew naturally inside its own borders. European settlers quickly noticed that indigenous communities were drinking a powerful caffeinated tea, and many colonists became fascinated by it. By the 1700s, Yaupon tea had entered colonial markets under names like Carolina tea, Indian tea, South Seas tea, and Caffeine. Some even believed it could compete with imported tea from China. Think about how insane that is. The United States had discovered a native caffeinated plant that required no overseas empire, while the British Empire was literally fighting global trade wars over tea. And unlike coffee, Yaupon had enormous advantages. It already grew in America. It tolerated heat. It tolerated storms. It tolerated poor soil. It didn't require massive mountain plantations. And because it was native to the region, it fit naturally into local ecosystems. No rainforest destruction. No industrial monoculture. No massive deforestation campaigns. Nature was already doing the farming, for free. If history had gone slightly differently, there's a real possibility that Americans today might be drinking Yaupon instead of coffee. Imagine walking into cafes and ordering roasted Yaupon. Imagine entire supermarket aisles dedicated to it. Imagine the United States becoming the world's largest exporter of its own native caffeine crop. For a brief moment, that future almost existed. But Yaupon had one massive problem: its scientific name. In the late 1700s, European botanists officially named the plant Ilex vomitoria. Vomitoria, a name that sounds less like a beverage and more like food poisoning. The reason behind it is complicated. Certain indigenous ceremonies involving Yaupon included ritual purification practices. Some participants consumed enormous quantities while fasting, and vomiting sometimes occurred during the ceremonies. European observers misunderstood what they were seeing. They assumed the plant itself caused vomiting. Modern researchers now believe that Yaupon was not inherently emetic at all, but the damage was already done. The scientific label stuck, and that label may have quietly destroyed the future of America's native caffeine industry, because while imported coffee became associated with sophistication, Yaupon became associated with sickness. One plant sounded elegant, the other sounded toxic. And public perception matters, especially when industries are forming, especially when consumers are choosing habits, especially when imported products already carried status and prestige. Coffee shops looked modern. European tea culture looked refined. Meanwhile, Yaupon became tied to stereotypes about poor rural Southerners and indigenous traditions dismissed by colonial society. Over time, America slowly abandoned its own native caffeine source. Not because it lacked caffeine, not because it tasted bad, not because it was difficult to grow, but because culture decided imported drinks felt more civilized. As global trade expanded, coffee exploded. European colonial powers transformed coffee into one of the largest agricultural industries on Earth. Huge plantations spread across Latin America. Entire economies became dependent on coffee exports. Governments invested in infrastructure built around coffee. Banks financed coffee production. Shipping routes adapted around it. And slowly, coffee stopped being just a drink. It became an empire. Meanwhile, Yaupon remained local, wild, unindustrialized, and that became a disadvantage, because industrial economies reward standardization. Coffee plantations could produce enormous, predictable harvests. Mass production favored crops that could be scaled aggressively. Wild native plants didn't fit neatly into that model. So America did what industrial societies often do. It replaced ecosystems with systems. Forests became agriculture. Native plants became commodities. Diversity became efficiency. And Yaupon faded deeper into obscurity. By the late 1800s, widespread Yaupon consumption had largely disappeared. Entire generations grew up without knowing their country had ever possessed a native caffeine tradition at all. That knowledge nearly vanished. But here's the strange part. Yaupon never actually disappeared. The plant survived. Quietly. While Americans imported billions of pounds of coffee, Yaupon continued growing in the background, across highways, near beaches, inside forests, along ranch land, in suburban landscaping, completely ignored. Imagine that. One of the only naturally caffeinated plants on the continent, treated like roadside decoration. At times, ranchers considered it invasive. Some spent enormous amounts of money removing it from their property. People destroyed a native caffeine source, while simultaneously importing caffeine from thousands of miles away. That contradiction feels almost absurd, especially today. Because modern consumers constantly talk about sustainability, local agriculture, reduced carbon footprints, environmental protection. Yet for generations, America ignored the caffeine plant already growing inside its own ecosystems. And this isn't just about Yaupon. It reflects a much larger pattern in history. Industrial civilization tends to overlook things that cannot be easily centralized. Wild abundance becomes invisible, especially when corporations profit from replacing it. To understand how strange the Yaupon story really is, you have to understand humanity's obsession with caffeine. Humans crossed deserts for tea, built trade routes for coffee, created plantations across continents, fought economic battles over stimulants. The British Empire became deeply tied to tea imports. Coffee houses influenced politics, finance, journalism, and revolution across Europe. Entire nations structured economies around caffeine production. Why? Because caffeine changes human behavior. It increases alertness, reduces fatigue, improves focus. And in industrial societies, that becomes extremely valuable. Factories loved caffeine. Offices loved caffeine. Modern capitalism practically runs on caffeine, which makes Yaupon even more fascinating. Because North America naturally possessed its own stimulant crop the entire time. Not imported, not exotic, native. That is incredibly rare. Most major caffeine plants evolved elsewhere. Coffee in Africa, tea in Asia, yerba mate in South America. But Yaupon evolved right inside North America, and somehow, almost nobody talks about it. There was one moment when Yaupon briefly returned, the American Civil War. When supply chains collapsed and imported coffee became difficult to obtain, many Southerners returned to local substitutes, and Yaupon resurfaced again. Think about what that means. Whenever global systems broke down, people rediscovered the plant growing naturally around them, because nature had already solved the problem centuries earlier. But after the war ended and trade resumed, coffee returned, and Yaupon faded back into the shadows. Again. It's almost like the plant only reappeared during moments of crisis, as if history kept trying to remind America that it already possessed its own caffeine source, and each time, the country ignored it. Then something unexpected happened. In the 21st century, people started rediscovering Yaupon. Researchers revisited old historical records. Botanists analyzed the chemistry. Entrepreneurs began experimenting with roasting methods. And suddenly, this forgotten native plant started appearing again. Small Yaupon tea companies emerged across Texas and Florida. Specialty cafes began serving it. Environmentalists praised it as a sustainable alternative to imported caffeine crops. And modern consumers discovered something surprising. It actually tastes good. Depending on preparation, Yaupon can taste earthy, smoky, grassy, slightly sweet, or similar to yerba mate. Some versions resemble green tea, others resemble black tea. Roasting changes everything, and unlike many teas, Yaupon contains relatively low tannin levels, making it less bitter. But the modern comeback is still tiny compared to coffee. Coffee remains a global giant. Yaupon is still mostly a niche curiosity, and yet, its resurgence raises a fascinating question. What other natural systems did industrial civilization abandon simply because imported systems became more profitable? At first glance, the Yaupon story seems simple. America discovered coffee. People preferred coffee. Yaupon disappeared. But that explanation misses something deeper. Because humans don't just consume products, we consume stories. Coffee came wrapped in global mythology, exotic mountains, European cafes, colonial trade, luxury, modernity. Meanwhile, Yaupon became associated with rural poverty, indigenous ritual, and an unfortunate scientific name. One beverage felt global, the other felt local. And modern societies often mistake global for superior. That pattern repeats constantly. Native foods get ignored until corporations rediscover them decades later and sell them back as premium products. Wild ecosystems are destroyed, then later imitated artificially. Traditional knowledge gets dismissed, then validated by modern science generations afterward. Yaupon fits perfectly into that pattern. America didn't lose the plant. It lost the cultural belief that the plant mattered. And once that belief disappeared, the forest became invisible. There's something deeply symbolic about the Yaupon story, because it represents the transition from natural abundance to industrial dependence. Imagine two systems. In one system, caffeine grows naturally across local ecosystems. Communities harvest it seasonally. Biodiversity survives. Nature does most of the work. In the other system, giant monoculture plantations dominate landscapes across continents. Forests get cleared. Supply chains stretch globally. Entire economies depend on exports. One system is slower, messier, more ecological. The other is massively scalable, highly profitable, hyper-efficient. Guess which system industrial civilization chose? That choice transformed the modern world. And coffee became one of the clearest examples of it. Today, billions of people depend on international caffeine supply chains every single morning. A shipping disruption can affect prices globally. Climate change threatens coffee-growing regions. Entire economies remain vulnerable to crop failures. Meanwhile, Yaupon still grows quietly across the American South, almost like history left behind a reminder. Ironically, the exact reasons Yaupon disappeared may now help bring it back. Because modern consumers increasingly care about local agriculture, native plants, sustainability, lower environmental impact, domestic production, and Yaupon checks all those boxes. It already grows in North America. It requires fewer agricultural inputs than imported caffeine crops. It tolerates harsh climates, and unlike coffee, it doesn't need tropical highlands thousands of miles away. That suddenly makes it interesting again, especially as climate pressures threaten global coffee production. Some researchers and entrepreneurs now wonder whether Yaupon could eventually become far more mainstream, not necessarily replacing coffee completely, but reclaiming a forgotten place in American culture. And honestly, that idea no longer sounds impossible, because humans are beginning to rediscover something ancient. Sometimes the future is hidden inside the things we ignored. Right now, somewhere in the American South, there's probably a Yaupon plant growing beside a road. Most people driving past it will never notice. They won't realize they're looking at one of the only naturally caffeinated plants native to North America. They won't realize entire civilizations once depended on it. They won't realize colonists once believed it could compete with imported tea and coffee. And they definitely won't realize that history almost turned this forgotten shrub into America's national drink. Instead, it became invisible. Not because the plant disappeared, but because industrial civilization trained people to value distant systems more than local abundance. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of the entire story. For thousands of years, America already had coffee. It was growing wild the whole time.